The Il Sol di Napoli restaurant was the most traditional in the city. Located in an upscale neighborhood known for attracting an elitist and influential clientele, the restaurant was a true gem for those who wished to enjoy authentic Italian cuisine. Vicente Moretti, the owner, was a middle-aged man known for his stern, conservative personality, and for many, his elitist demeanor. Vicente had inherited the restaurant from his father, an Italian immigrant who dedicated his life to building the establishment's prestige. Over the years, Vicente transformed Il Sol di Napoli into a symbol of status, where only the wealthiest felt welcome. However, his behavior concealed a dark side. Vicente held an extremely prejudiced view of the world, which directly influenced how he managed his restaurant. On that Saturday night, the restaurant was as crowded as ever. Vicente watched the entrance closely, his sharp eyes scanning the clientele. He knew who the regulars were and who appeared sporadically. However, something different happened. A couple he had never seen before entered the dining area. They were a man and a woman, well-dressed, elegant, but with a characteristic that did not go unnoticed by Vicente. They were black. Richard and Milena entered hand in hand, exchanging loving glances. It was a special night for both. They were celebrating their third wedding anniversary and had chosen Il Sol di Napoli for its impeccable reputation. However, as soon as they crossed the threshold, they noticed the change in the atmosphere. The sound of conversations dimmed, and the previously carefree glances were now directed at them, including the stern gaze of Vicente. Vicente approached the couple with firm steps, a cold smile on his face. "May I help you?" he asked, but his voice carried a tone of disdain that did not go unnoticed. "We have a reservation under the name Richard Cardoso," Richard replied, maintaining his composure, although he felt the discomfort emanating from the owner. Vicente frowned, pretending to look through the reservation book. "I'm sorry, but we don't have a reservation under that name. Besides, we're fully booked tonight." Richard and Milena exchanged surprised glances. They had made the reservation a week in advance. "This must be a mistake," Milena said, trying to stay calm. "We can wait until a table is available." Vicente crossed his arms, now openly showing his hostility. "There won't be any tables available for you tonight," he said, his voice carrying a firmness that allowed no questioning. "I suggest you find another place." The rejection was an unexpected blow. Richard opened his mouth to protest, but Milena touched his arm, silently pleading for them to leave the restaurant without making a scene. The couple, with no other choice, turned and left Il Sol di Napoli, the sound of laughter and murmurs from the other patrons echoing in their ears. Outside, the rain began to fall, reflecting the mood of Richard and Milena. They got into the car in silence, the atmosphere between them heavy. But as Richard started the engine, a fierce determination grew within him. He wasn't going to let this slide. Milena, noticing the look on her husband's face, knew this was far from over. Inside the restaurant, Vicente watched the couple walk away through the window, feeling a perverse satisfaction at seeing his authority and prejudice reaffirmed. He had no idea that that night would be the beginning of a series of events that would change his life forever. The next morning, Vicente was satisfied. The night had been busy, and he believed he had made the right decision in maintaining the exclusivity of his restaurant. However, as the days passed, something began to change. The number of regular customers decreased. Vicente noticed a growing emptiness at the tables, and the reservation calls, once constant, began to dwindle. Suspicious, Vicente decided to investigate. He started asking his most loyal customers if they had heard anything, but they all seemed evasive, mentioning that they were traveling or busy. This made him even more uncomfortable. He wasn't used to this kind of mystery in his establishment. A week later, while Vicente was flipping through the local newspaper, one particular article caught his attention. It was a column on dining experiences, and the title made him shiver. "When exclusivity crosses the line, the case of Il Sol di Napoli." The article described in detail the incident of the previous night, portraying Vicente as a prejudiced owner who expelled a black couple for no reason other than their skin color. The names of the couple, Richard and Milena Cardoso, were mentioned, and the narrative made sure to highlight the injustice and prejudice behind Vicente's actions. The reaction was immediate. Critical comments began to surface on social media, and Il Sole di Napoli became the target of boycotts and criticism. Vicente, who once had absolute control over his small kingdom, now saw everything crumbling. Desperate, he decided it was time to defend himself. He contacted a lawyer and began planning a strategy to protect himself from the consequences, unaware that the truth behind the couple he had expelled was much more complex and devastating than he could have imagined. Vicente was in his office, the sunlight streaming through the partially closed window, when the phone rang. It was his lawyer, Carlos Freitas, a trusted man who had handled the restaurant's legal affairs for years. Vicente explained the situation, trying in some way to justify his actions, but Carlos was direct. Vicente, the situation is delicate. The case has gained negative attention very quickly, and this is affecting the restaurant. We need to proceed cautiously, but there's something you need to know before we make any decisions. Vicente felt a chill run down his spine. What is it? Richard Cardoso and Milena are not ordinary people. Richard is an extremely influential businessman in the technology sector, one of the leading investors in several successful startups. He is also known for his philanthropic work, especially in causes related to social justice and racial equality. Milena, on the other hand, is a renowned lawyer and human rights activist, known for her fight against racism and discrimination. The revelation left Vicente stunned. He stood up, pacing around the office, trying to absorb what he had just heard. So they have power? Carlos paused before responding. Yes, and a lot of it. What you did was extremely harmful, not only to your image but to the survival of the restaurant. Vicente felt the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had never imagined that this couple could have so much power and influence. And now, he was in their sights. What can we do? He asked, his voice wavering for the first time in a long while. We need to reach out to them, offer a sincere apology, and try to resolve this amicably before the damage becomes irreversible. If they decide to sue or take the issue to the public in a more aggressive way, I don't know how we can get around it. Vicente swallowed hard. The idea of apologizing to those people was humiliating for him, but he had no choice. The future of Il Sole di Napoli was at stake. Do it. Arrange a meeting with them. Carlos agreed, promising to try to contact them as soon as possible. But as Vicente hung up the phone, he couldn't help but feel vulnerable. Never in his life had he felt so powerless. 2 days later, the meeting was scheduled at a neutral law firm office downtown. Vicente was visibly nervous. He arrived at the location accompanied by Carlos, who gave him some quick instructions before they entered the meeting room. Richard and Milena were already there, sitting side by side, maintaining a calm but serious demeanor. Vicente tried to gauge their expressions, but they remained impassive, which made him even more uneasy. Carlos took the lead, greeting the couple and initiating the dialogue. Mr. and Mrs. Cardoso, we appreciate you accepting this meeting. Mr. Moretti would like to express his apologies for the incident at the restaurant and discuss how we can repair the damage caused. Richard observed Vicente for a moment, his piercing eyes studying the man before him. I want to hear it from his mouth, Richard said firmly. Vicente, who had been trying to stay calm, felt his pride wounded but knew he had to move forward. He took a deep breath and began to speak. Mr. Cardoso, Mrs. Milena, I'm sorry for what happened that night. I admit I was hasty in my actions, and I shouldn't have treated you that way. Milena crossed her arms, her gaze fixed on Vicente. Was it just haste, or is there something deeper in your attitude? You judged us by our skin color, Vicente, and that cannot be simply overlooked. The room fell silent. Vicente felt the weight of the accusation, but he knew she was right. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right, he said, trying to maintain his composure. Richard remained silent for a moment before speaking. Making this right goes beyond a simple apology. The damage has already been done, not just to us, but to everyone who frequents or works at your restaurant. But there is one thing you can do. Vicente looked at Richard, trying to guess what he was about to say. We want you to use this situation to promote real change. We want you to review your policies and make room for more diversity, both in your staff and among your clientele. And more than that, We want you to publicly commit to fighting racism, starting with supporting the causes we advocate for." The request caught Vicente by surprise. He expected financial compensation or something similar, but what Richard was asking for was much deeper. It was a change in mindset, a change that would shake everything he believed in and how he conducted his life and business. The hesitation was evident on Vicente's face, but he knew he was cornered. "If I do this, will you let this story die?" Milena leaned forward, looking directly into Vicente's eyes. "We don't want to destroy you, Vicente. We want you to learn and grow from this. The choice is yours." Vicente felt the weight of that decision. The change that Richard and Milena were demanding wouldn't be easy, and he knew he would have to confront his own prejudices and resistances. But the fear of losing everything he had built, coupled with the power the couple held, made him yield. "I accept," he finally said, his voice grave. "I'll do whatever it takes." With the agreement in place, word quickly spread that Vicente Moretti had publicly committed to transforming Il Sol di Napoli into a more inclusive and diverse place. He hired consultants specializing in diversity and inclusion to overhaul the restaurant's practices, from employee recruitment to the training of the entire staff. Despite the changes, Vicente felt uncomfortable. The idea of giving up control and allowing people he had previously ignored or despised to participate in the operation of his restaurant was unsettling. But every time he thought of resisting, he remembered Richard's penetrating gaze and what could happen if he went back on his promise. The first significant change came with the hiring of new employees. Vicente had no choice but to open the doors to a more diverse team, which caused a stir among the old staff. Some adapted, others resigned, but Vicente remained firm despite his own reservations. Richard and Milena closely followed the changes, frequently visiting the restaurant to check on the progress. Their presence always made Vicente tense, but over time, he began to notice something unexpected. The restaurant's atmosphere was changing, and for the better. New customers began frequenting Il Sol di Napoli, attracted by the new inclusion and diversity policy. The quality of service improved, and the new team brought renewed energy to the place. Vicente began to see the positive impact of the changes, although he was reluctant to admit to himself that those people he once despised were contributing to the restaurant's renewed success. One day, after a particularly busy night, Vicente found himself alone in the restaurant, reflecting on everything that had happened. He still struggled with his prejudices, but he couldn't deny the results. The change hadn't been easy, but it was proving beneficial, both for the business and for his own conscience, though he still had a long way to go to overcome his biases. But what Vicente didn't know was that the biggest revelation was yet to come, something that would not only change his perception of the world, but also of himself. Months passed, and Il Sol di Napoli began to stabilize after the initial turmoil. The changes implemented in the restaurant became a natural part of the environment, and Vicente, although still struggling with his old beliefs, began to notice the difference these transformations had made. The restaurant not only regained its prestige, but also attracted a more diverse and, surprisingly, more loyal clientele. One autumn afternoon, while Vicente was reviewing the restaurant's finances in his office, he received a call from Carlos Freitas, his lawyer. "Vicente, we need to talk. There's something you should know." Vicente frowned. Carlos's tone did not indicate good news. "What happened?" "I can't talk over the phone. I need you to come to my office as soon as possible." Intrigued and apprehensive, Vicente left the restaurant and headed to Carlos's office. When he arrived, he was immediately ushered into the meeting room, where Carlos was seated with a serious expression. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Vicente," Carlos began. "There's something that came up during the investigation of the Cardoso couple, something we can't ignore." Vicente felt a chill run down his spine. "What did you find out?" Carlos hesitated for a moment before sliding an envelope toward Vicente. "Here are documents that reveal something surprising. You need to be prepared for what you're about to read." Vicente took the envelope with trembling hands and began to flip through the papers. His expression quickly changed from curiosity to shock. The documents were adoption records and old inheritance papers. Richard Cardoso wasn't just an influential businessman. He had a much more personal connection to Vicente than he could ever have imagined. "Richard Cardoso is your half-brother, Vicente," Carlos finally said, breaking the silence. "Your father had a relationship before he married your mother. Richard is the child from that relationship." Vicente was silent, unable to process the information. He knew his father's story, but had never imagined he had another child, much less a black child, whom he had treated with such contempt. "Richard's father died when he was still young, and his mother raised him alone," Carlos continued. "They didn't have much, but Richard worked hard and managed to achieve everything he has today. When he discovered his true lineage, he began investigating his father's family, which led him to you." Vicente felt his world collapsing around him. Everything he believed in, all his pride and prejudice, now seemed small and insignificant in the face of the truth. He had expelled his own brother from his restaurant, had judged and despised someone who shared the same blood. Why didn't he say anything? Vicente asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I don't know, Vicente. Maybe he wanted to see how you would react on your own, without the influence of that information. Or maybe he was waiting for the right moment to reveal everything," Carlos replied. Vicente felt himself sinking into the chair, the weight of the revelation crushing his spirit. Everything made sense now. Richard's calm and controlled behavior, his insistence on promoting changes in the restaurant, and the look he gave Vicente. Richard knew who he was all along. In the days that followed, Vicente was consumed by a whirlwind of emotions. He avoided the restaurant, preferring to stay at home, trying to process the truth. His mind revisited every interaction with Richard, now from a new perspective. How could he have been so blind? How did he not see what was right in front of his eyes? One night, unable to sleep, Vicente decided he needed to confront Richard. He picked up the phone and dialed the number Carlos had given him, hoping Richard would answer. After a few rings, Richard's familiar voice came through on the other end of the line. "Vicente," Richard said, immediately recognizing the number. "We need to talk," Vicente said bluntly. Richard paused before responding. "Meet me at the restaurant tomorrow. I'll be there." The next morning, Vicente arrived at Il Sol di Napoli before the doors opened. He found Richard already seated at a table, observing the surroundings. The restaurant was empty, silent, and the tension in the air was palpable. Vicente approached the table, sitting down across from Richard. For a moment, the two men remained silent, as if words were difficult to find. Finally, Vicente broke the ice. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Richard looked at him for a long moment before replying. "I wanted to see who you really were. I wanted to know if there was any possibility of you changing, of recognizing your mistakes before you knew the truth." "You must hate me," Vicente said, his voice barely able to contain the guilt and shame he felt. Richard slowly shook his head. "I've been angry with you, Vicente. Angry for the way you treated my mother, for the way you've lived your life without caring about others. But hate? Hate is a dangerous thing. It consumes us, destroys us. I chose to channel my energy into something more productive." Vicente felt a lump in his throat. "I've been a fool, Richard. I lived my entire life believing in the wrong things, hurting people I didn't even know. And now, to discover that you're my brother, I don't know how to handle this." Richard sighed, his eyes reflecting a deep sadness. "Vicente, I'm not going to lie to you. This isn't easy for me either. I spent my life without a father, without a paternal family, and when I finally discover I have a brother, he treats me like an enemy. But I'm not here to destroy you. I'm here to try to build something better, even if it means starting from scratch." Richard's words deeply resonated with Vicente. He realized that despite everything, there was a chance for redemption, a chance to try to make peace with the past and build something meaningful for the future. "I want to try," Vicente said sincerely. "I want to change, not just for the restaurant, but for myself. And if there's room, I want to build this relationship with you as brothers." Richard watched Vicente carefully, as if evaluating every word, every intention. After a long moment, he nodded slightly. "It will be a process, Vicente. Trust won't just appear out of nowhere, but I'm willing to try. Not because of what we are, but because of what we can become." Vicente nodded, feeling a spark of hope for the first time. The road would be long and full of challenges, but he was willing to walk it alongside the brother he never knew he had. The following months were marked by a gradual transformation, both at Il Sole di Napoli and in Vicente's personal life. Richard and Milena continued to frequent the restaurant, now as friends and allies, not just customers. Vicente began to actively participate in the changes at the restaurant, no longer out of obligation, but because he finally understood the importance of creating a welcoming and inclusive environment. The relationship between Vicente and Richard also began to develop, albeit slowly and cautiously. They started meeting regularly, not just at the restaurant, but in more personal moments like dinners at home and walks in the park. Vicente began to learn more about Richard's life, about his struggles and achievements, and each conversation brought a new layer of respect and admiration between them. On the other hand, Vicente also began to open up about his own life, his insecurities, and how he was raised. He told Richard about the weight of the expectations his father placed on him, about the need to keep the restaurant as a symbol of status and power. Richard listened patiently, understanding that, although it didn't justify it, Vicente's upbringing had been shaped by these pressures. Over time, the restaurant became a symbol of reconciliation and change. Its new reputation attracted media attention again, but this time in a positive way. Il Sole di Napoli was featured in reports as an example of how a business can reinvent itself and become a space of inclusion and diversity. Vicente began to feel lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He knew he still had a lot to learn and improve, but he was no longer the same man who had been at the beginning of this journey. He was willing to confront his prejudices and become a better person, both as a businessman and as a human being. One day, Richard invited Vicente to a special event at his home. When Vicente arrived, he was warmly welcomed by Milena, who guided him to the garden where Richard was waiting. To his surprise, the place was full of people, Richard's friends and family, many of whom Vicente didn't know. "Today is a special day, Vicente," Richard said as he led him to the center of the garden. "I want you to meet the people who are important to me. And more than that, I want you to be part of this family." Vicente was speechless as Richard introduced him to everyone, explaining who he was and how they were growing closer. The gesture deeply touched Vicente, who realized that for the first time in a long time, he was no longer alone. He had a new family, one that was willing to accept and support him, as long as he continued on the path of change. As time passed, the changes at Il Sole di Napoli not only solidified but flourished. The restaurant became a living example of how diversity and inclusion can enrich an environment, both culturally and economically. Vicente, now with a new understanding of the world around him, began to value more the people he worked with and the customers who frequented his restaurant. The changes also reflected in his personal life. Vicente rebuilt his relationship with Richard, now not just as brothers, but as partners on a new journey. They decided together to expand Il Sole di Napoli, opening new restaurants in other cities, each with the same commitment to inclusion and diversity that they had implemented in the original. Vicente also began to get involved in community projects, something he had never considered before. He used his influence to support social justice causes and started collaborating with Milena on some of her initiatives. Although still learning, he felt motivated and inspired by the transformation he was experiencing. The press, which had once harshly criticized Vicente, now celebrated his transformation. He was invited to speak at events, to share his story of redemption, and to show how prejudice can be overcome when confronted with courage and honesty. The restaurant thrived, but more important than financial success was the social impact it had. People felt welcomed, respected, and valued at Il Sole di Napoli. And that was something Vicente was now proud to have helped create. Years passed, and Il Sole di Napoli continued to be a success. Vicente, now older and wiser, looked at everything he had built, not with empty pride, but with deep satisfaction for having managed to change. He knew he still had flaws, but he had learned to accept them and work to overcome them. One evening, sitting at one of the restaurant tables alongside Richard and Milena, Vicente watched the customers dining, talking, and laughing. The atmosphere was joyful, diverse, and welcoming, exactly the opposite of what it had been in the past. Richard turned to Vicente, a smile on his face. "Look at what we've built, brother. This is much more than a restaurant. It's a legacy." Vicente nodded, feeling emotional. "Yes, it is. And it all started with a decision. The decision to change." As the sun set, bathing Il Sol di Napoli in a golden light, Vicente realized that he had finally found the peace he had been searching for. He was no longer the bitter and prejudiced man he had once been. Now, he was someone willing to learn, to grow, and to build a better future, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. And so, Il Sol di Napoli continued to shine, not just as a symbol of good food, but as a beacon of hope, redemption, and the possibility of change.